The Soviet-Afghan War raged for 10 years and killed over 15,000 Russian soldiers. It was a devastatingly costly campaign for the Soviet Union that directly led to its downfall and collapse. On February 24, 2022, Putin said, "Hold my beer," and launched an even worse military disaster. But is Putin's Ukrainian invasion really a failure, or are we all guilty of falling for Western propaganda, as Russia would claim? Getting good intelligence on the ongoing invasion of Ukraine is difficult, which makes drawing conclusions equally difficult. Wars are very dynamic things, and what starts off blazingly well can end in disaster or quagmire. Just ask the United States after 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. In both cases, U.S. forces utterly decimated the conventional forces of each nation and then spent 20 years fighting an insurgency, only to leave with a strategic defeat that left the situation worse for America than before the invasion. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has had immediate and very large red flags straight from day one that signal this will be one of Russia's worst defeats since the start of World War II. For starters, it's become abundantly clear that Vladimir Putin was operating on very faulty intelligence when he launched the invasion. Shortly before Russian forces moved to staging areas, he tasked his intelligence apparatus with infiltrating Ukraine and bribing or intimidating Ukrainian military and political officials into cooperating with Russia. These intelligence agents were also supposed to take the general temperature of the population in order to gauge whether or not Ukraine could muster the will to fight an invasion. Perhaps unsurprisingly for the Russian dictator, the verdict was exactly what he wanted to hear. Ukraine was not just ready for an invasion, but its population would welcome Russian soldiers with open arms and warm borscht. Well, that's the problem with being a dictator surrounded by yes-men. Nobody is going to tell you the truth. The second problem with running such a regime is that your underlings are no doubt just as murderous and corrupt as you are. So it was of no surprise when rumors began to circulate that the Russian intelligence agents had not just borscht their job up, but had actually siphoned off large amounts of funds dedicated to their intelligence operations into private accounts. To be fair, Russia's operatives had succeeded in some ways. For instance, when the invasion reached Kherson, the bridges leading to the vitally important city were supposed to have been mined and prepped for demolition. Somebody, though, had ordered the mines and explosives removed, clearing the way for Russian invaders to cross the bridges. President Zelensky would respond by firing multiple senior political leaders from the region. Yet overwhelmingly, as Russian troops crossed the border into Ukraine, they were met with Molotovs and Kalashnikovs, not borscht and hugs as expected. But this wasn't the only strategic failure on Russia's behalf, even before the fighting started. As planning for the invasion began, Russia failed to account for the current state of Ukraine's armed forces. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, it did so with little opposition from Ukraine's armed forces. Overwhelmingly, the Ukrainian military melted away and retreated from the fighting. 8 years later, Russia believed that Ukraine's armed forces would repeat their performance of 2014, but failed to take into account that for the last 8 years, the United States had sent hundreds of trainers and senior military personnel to train Ukraine in order to restructure their armed forces. While the process was still ongoing and incomplete as the invasion started, the military that met the Russian invaders was a vastly different machine than what retreated en masse during the 2014 invasion. More mobile, more efficient, and trained in Western doctrine, Ukraine's military did not fall back as expected, but put up stiff resistance that soon slowed Russia's advances to a crawl. The failure to account for both Ukraine's willingness to fight and its military's new capabilities led to immediate disaster at the start of the war. Russia opened its gambit for Ukraine with a deep penetration air assault straight into the political heart of the nation, Kyiv. Its plan was simple, and given its 2014 successes and perceived overwhelming overmatch in firepower, should have worked. Fly Russia's most elite air assault forces to the outskirts of the capital, set up an air bridge, fly in reinforcements, and walk into Kyiv to execute Zelensky and replace him with a pro-Kremlin figure. The stubborn and uncooperative former Soviet republic soon once more would be back in the fold. Except that's not how things turned out. For starters, the air assault into Kyiv was terribly prepared and executed even worse. The linchpin of the entire operation was the Anatov airport, which was the primary target of Russia's air assault on Kyiv. Located just 10 miles from the heart of the capital, this airport had large enough runways to accommodate Russia's heavy-lift airplanes. A successful assault here would allow Russia to simply fly in heavy equipment and rapidly move into Kyiv itself. But Ukrainian resistance was not just stiffer than anticipated, but better equipped. As 2 to 3 dozen Russian helicopters approached the airport, they were met with man-pad fire. Regular air defenses had been successfully neutralized, but Ukrainian defenders were armed with man-pads provided by the West. Multiple helicopters were either destroyed or forced to land, disrupting the flow of the assault. Eventually, the defenders were overwhelmed, but Ukraine had been warned by the American CIA of an assault on the airport and was already mustering response forces. Without any heavy vehicles of their own, Russia's paratroopers were dependent on Russian aircraft for support. But these were met by Ukrainian fighters and were limited in their effectiveness. Ukrainian ground attack aircraft such as the Su-24s also pounded Russian positions. By the end of the first day of fighting, Russia's elite paratroopers had been defeated and forced to retreat into the forest outside the airport. There, they linked up with the Russian ground assault coming from Belarus and eventually wrestled control of the airport away from the Ukrainians. However, by then the airport had been so badly damaged, Russia couldn't use it anymore. Russia's failure to account for Ukrainian anti-tank weapons meant that the Belarus assault force was greatly delayed in linking up with the air assault. Left relying on spotty air cover, the lightly armed paratroopers were defeated and forced to retreat, while the heavy fighting and Ukrainian sabotage destroyed runways and made the airport impossible to use as an air bridge. This type of extremely shoddy strategic thinking quickly became a hallmark of the entire invasion. It very soon became apparent that Russia was either incompetent, was entirely too confident of its own abilities, or had severely underestimated Ukrainian will and capabilities. Truth is, all three of those things are true to a degree. Russian incompetence is evident in the entire invasion plan. As many Western observers noted, Russia made the completely unprecedented and confounding decision to launch a full-scale invasion without first conducting an air and missile campaign inside Ukraine. Modern military doctrine states that before using ground forces, one first uses strike aircraft and missile assaults to soften up a nation's defenses. This includes strikes against air defenses, command and control nodes, supply and logistics hubs, and radar installations. When the U.S. and coalition forces launched Desert Storm, air power was used to dismantle Iraq's ability to effectively control its own forces before a single tank crossed into Kuwait. Attacks against Iraqi air bases and radar sites also allowed coalition aircraft to rule the skies and denied Iraqi forces air support. Russia did none of this and instead launched its air campaign at the same time as its troops were crossing the border into Ukraine. What's more, it's become clear that its intelligence and recon capabilities were not up to par, as a significant number of its strikes failed to neutralize intended targets. This left Ukraine with a fully operational air force and air defense network that took a heavy toll on the Russians, while allowing Ukrainian aircraft to provide fire support for ground forces. Given that Russia operates the second largest air fleet in the world, it's absolutely baffling that the Russian aerospace forces, whose budget is larger than all of Ukraine's military budget combined, could not and still haven't won the war for Ukraine's skies. As the war continued, Russian basic military competency came into serious question. Everywhere you looked, it seemed as if Russians' military planners simply weren't up to the task, though this analysis might be skewed by the staggering amount of corruption within the Russian military. Things like bad tires leading to dozens of perfectly operational vehicles being abandoned can be blamed on corruption, with the unit commanders skimming the maintenance and acquisition budget and buying cheap Chinese tires for their vehicles instead of the military-grade tires they require. But the fact that abandoned vehicles showed clear signs of sun rot in their tires on only one side of the tire is evidence that Russian maintenance personnel are either poorly trained or its military is criminally inept. When kept in storage, vehicles must be rotated on a set schedule in order to avoid sun damage on only one side of the vehicle. It was clear that Russia had not done this, and the simple mistake cost them tens of millions in lost vehicles that Ukraine happily put to use. The US military has a saying: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Russia, it seems, has maintained its Soviet-era doctrine of under-equipping its units with logistics personnel and vehicles. Compared to an American unit, Russia assigns on average half as many logistics personnel and vehicles, meaning that its ability to project power far from its own borders is very limited. This was no clearer than in the suburbs of Kyiv, where the infamous 40-mile-long convoy of military vehicles would have its day in military infamy. Starved of fuel, ammo, and even food, Russian personnel either abandoned the vehicles or were forced to come to a dead standstill. The rapid advance on Kyiv, which was the linchpin of Russia's entire war strategy, failed because of its own doctrinal incompetence, and Ukraine took full advantage, ruthlessly attacking Russian supply lines. Rather than kill tanks, Ukrainian special forces went hunting for Russian trucks, to great effect. Each truck lost meant another 2 to 3 tons less food, ammo, and fuel, which meant an even slower and more vulnerable advance. Russia inevitably was forced to retreat from Kyiv and instead focused on its more successful operations in the east of Ukraine. Here it was steadily gaining ground, but the arrival of Western smart weapons such as US HIMARS rapidly changed the strategic picture for Russia. Failing to take into account the use of smart weapons, Russia suffered staggering losses of command personnel and supplies. This wasn't the only way that Russia failed to take into account how 21st century war was waged, as horrible electronic and signals intelligence discipline directly led to the assassination of dozens of senior military officers and the destruction of dozens of strategically important targets. Russian military personnel and reporters were freely streaming from near or adjacent to sensitive military sites, and its leaders were often using unsecured communication methods. All of this intelligence was very quickly scooped up by the West and directly fed to the frontline Ukrainian units armed with smart munitions, with predictable results for the Russians. In 6 months of fighting, Russia has lost more senior officers than the US lost in all of its conflicts since World War II. And it all comes down to a basic failure to understand 21st century warfare, as well as gross incompetence. Despite all this, however, Russia was winning the war for Ukraine, even if it was at an incredibly unsustainable win rate. However, in early September, Ukraine launched a massive counteroffensive that changed this and exposed yet another strategic failure from Russia. For well over a month, Ukraine had very loudly broadcast its plans to launch an invasion in the south with the goal of retaking Kherson. Russia took the bait and moved many of its best fighting forces from the north to the south. When the attack was launched, Ukrainian shaping operations using long-range precision HIMARS strikes led to some modest gains around the city. However, Russian forces were completely blindsided by a massive Ukrainian counteroffensive in the north, where its forces were weakest. While Ukraine had exercised strict operational security to keep the offensive a secret, even Russian military bloggers had made note of the buildup of Ukrainian forces in the north. Russian intelligence, however, completely missed the clues, and its forces were utterly overwhelmed, leading to a massive defeat and panicked withdrawal from the region. Russian apologists were quick to point out that the units in the north were some of Russia's least effective, and thus Ukraine's win is only temporary, as the moment that Russia's regular forces return to the area, Ukraine will be on the back foot once more. Yet this does not ring true at all, as a growing body of evidence shows that units such as Russia's vaunted 1st Guards tank army was present at Kharkiv and had not only been defeated but forced to flee in a panic, leaving behind many of its tanks for the Ukrainians. This is a clear indication that even Russia's best forces are having great difficulty inside Ukraine. The 1st Guards tank army was the very vanguard of Russia's ground forces. This was the force that was meant to smash into the teeth of NATO's best defenses in case of war and win. But what's perhaps even more telling for Russia's difficulties is the fact that even with Ukraine launching an offensive only miles from its own border, Russia's air force appeared to be mostly MIA from the fight. When you can't project air power literally miles from your own border, your military is in seriously bad shape. So, is Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine a failure? Well, after the Kharkiv offensive and the panicked retreat of its military, Russia has the dubious distinction of becoming Ukraine's #1 supplier of military vehicles. Directly supplying your enemy with more heavy vehicles than they had before you started fighting is not the best way to win a war. But Russia remains a massive military power, even if it seems incapable of using that power with any great amount of precision or aptitude. Reports from the Kharkiv offensive clearly showed that the Russian military is suffering from serious morale problems, and there's even reports of one artillery unit not undertaking a single fire mission during one day of fighting because the entire crew was drunk. This would seem incredible in a Western military, but it's frighteningly commonplace inside of the Russian military, where discipline is incredibly low even during peacetime. Such incidents were commonplace during both Chechen conflicts. Russia has not lost the battle for Ukraine, and the war is almost inevitably to drag on for another 6 months or longer. But strategically, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a definite failure, even if it were to magically win overnight for some reason. For its aggression, Russia has become a pariah state, and unprecedented Western sanctions, bordering on what it might face in case of a real war against the West, have left the Russian economy in a seriously perilous state. For the moment, the worst of the damage is being contained thanks to a large war chest Putin had accumulated before the war. But that money will run out sooner rather than later, given that half of that money is in Western bank accounts that are now frozen. Sanctions will soon bite into the Russian economy even harder than they have been, and the ruble is seen as a Potemkin currency that's only being propped up by extreme measures that simply can't last. But the real problem for Russia is that many of its best and brightest professionals and artists have fled the nation in droves, weakening its ability to compete in a 21st century global economy. For its military, sanctions have been especially painful. Cut off from advanced Western technological components, Russia's military has nearly exhausted its supply of precision weapons. It's also having great difficulty manufacturing things such as air defense missiles, with one plant shut down and its workers told they could either go on unpaid leave or get paid to go and fight in Ukraine. When you're sending trained engineers to go fight and die in a trench, you're not doing your future self any favors. Even if Russia were to win in Ukraine, it would do so at a cost so steep that some in the West wonder if the nation isn't even now under the threat of breaking up. What would be left of Russia is a shadow of a power with a military that would take a decade or more to rebuild, and forced to rebuild with 20th century technology as it remains cut off from Western imports. Reduced to a shadow of itself, Russia's only real clout internationally would be its formidable nuclear arsenal. However, the clearest sign that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a massive strategic failure is that its very goal was to prevent the strengthening of the West against Russia. Yet the result is that Vladimir Putin is the only Russian leader who ever set out to weaken NATO and accidentally made it even stronger, thanks to Sweden and Finland's ascension into the alliance. At this point, Vladimir Putin has so thoroughly crippled his own nation that the American CIA should be naming buildings in his honor for his hard work in weakening the US's chief rival. Now, go check out the US weapon beating Russians in Ukraine, or click this other video instead.